Hello and welcome to another episode of Peace at Last, the podcast that interprets the latest scientific discoveries in psychology, explain techniques and principles from ancient spiritual traditions, and gives you tools to put them into practice. You can change the way you feel and find peace at last. My name is Fabrice Nye, and when I don't podcast, I work as a psychologist and coach in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm also a spiritual traveler. If you like what you hear on this podcast, you may subscribe on the platform of your choice. I also invite you to share your favorite episode with people who might benefit from it. You're listening to episode number 4, and today is the first part of a series on thinking traps, also known as cognitive distortions, or also as faulty thinking. A little bit of housekeeping before I dive into the heart of the matter. I want to thank Bevan Barton for his review on Apple iTunes. He wrote this: "Great and practical podcast on psychology, ancient wisdom, and spirituality. I first heard Fabrice on David Burns' podcast and was excited to hear he was starting his own that would cover more than just psychology. I find Fabrice very relatable. Originally a tech person, he went into psychology after stresses of the startup life, and a desire to give back made him reconsider his trajectory. I appreciate his humility. He shares ideas from many other teachers, doesn't claim to have all the answers, and identifies not only as a teacher, who gives us practical exercises during his episodes, but also as a student. His emphasis on peace rather than happiness or energy or quote-unquote success is a refreshing contrast to today's materialistic, outward-directed world. I'm looking forward to learning about this varied but related interest of psychology, spirituality, and how we Stone Age apes can best live in the modern environment. Thanks, Fabrice." Well, Bevan, I very much appreciate the care you took in reviewing my new podcast. And I thank you for your enthusiasm and your vote of confidence. I can really tell that you're paying close attention to the content, both of this podcast and also of the one that I started 3.5 years ago with David. Now, without further ado, let's talk about thinking traps. In this series, I will describe 15 or so thinking traps. And so as not to overwhelm you with such a long list, I will break it down into several parts. But even though that sounds like a long list, it doesn't mean at all that it is exhaustive. We'll just be looking here at the most common thinking traps, especially the ones that cause distress for us. To do them justice, I want to say that they would each really deserve their own episode. But at this stage, we're just going over the basics, and I will bundle them up and try to summarize as best as I can. For those of you who have been faithful listeners of my previous podcast with David, the Feeling Good podcast, this might be a little bit of a review, and I hope you bear with me because I really want to lay the foundation for everyone who picks up this podcast so that we know what the main components of our thinking patterns are. So, giving credit where credit is due, Albert Ellis describes some of those thinking traps first. He's observed that his clients often thought in terms of must, quote-unquote must, or ought to, and he coined the term must-urbation, which characterizes the unrealistic demands that people put on themselves, on others, or on the world. In turn, those demands, they can lead to these other thinking traps that he called awfulizing and catastrophizing. So we'll talk about this. And Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, proposed a theory behind the thinking traps that he called cognitive distortions. I talked about this a little bit during the first episode when I described Aaron Beck's research. Beck added a few more to Albert Ellis's collection, and my own mentor, Dr. David Burns, gifted the field with some of the more common names for the cognitive distortions. Most of the ones I will describe in the next few episodes are his contribution. So, I want to say a word about the difference between thinking traps aka cognitive distortions, and let's say thinking errors, aka cognitive biases. A little caveat here. The distinction I'm about to make is my own. Different psychologists also have different ways to distinguish the two. Because, to tell you the truth, the boundary between thinking traps and cognitive biases is rather fuzzy. The main difference, in my opinion, is that thinking traps result in difficult emotions, in mental distress, and in psychopathology. So you may say that this is a rather utilitarian view of the definition. But what we're interested here is our main goal for the journey, which is to find peace. So in contrast, the cognitive biases are more broadly related to, let's say, an inaccurate perception of reality. And you could say that it's also true of the thinking traps, and you would be correct. What does that mean? That means that thinking traps are a subset of cognitive biases. It's just that some, I even may want to say many, of the cognitive biases do not result automatically in mental distress. Here's what I mean. These are some examples of cognitive biases. Here's one called the Availability Heuristic. That's when we focus first and foremost on what has been presented to us most frequently and most forcefully. For example, if I hear about crime in the newspaper and on the radio, I may feel like I live in a dangerous place, although my neighborhood may be quite safe. Another cognitive bias is called the empathy gap. That's when I misjudge how I will feel when I'm in a situation that's different from right now. So for example, I can tell myself that I won't touch the cookie tray when I go to the party, but when I'm there, I'm just going to start to devour them compulsively. My present self was not able to empathize with my future self. Here's a third example of cognitive bias. It's called anchoring. That's where we depend on an initial piece of information as we are making decisions. So for example, a salesperson tells me that a new appliance retails for a dollar amount of $1,000. But today, I'm getting a deal. It's discounted down to $4.99. So, since my brain was anchored on the $1,000 amount, I feel like I'm getting a deal, even though that may be the price they sell it at all the time. And there are dozens more cognitive biases. But you may have noticed in the examples I gave you, they can lead to seeing the world inaccurately, hence the name thinking errors, but they don't necessarily cause automatic mental distress, or at least not in the moment when we believe them. So that's cognitive biases. And I'm sure that we'll have a chance to come back to some of those cognitive biases in future episodes. Now, if the subject is of interest to you, and for me it's really a fascinating subject, I recommend another great podcast called You Are Not So Smart by David McCraney. If you subscribe, tell him I sent you. So, the first group of thinking traps that we're covering in this episode is what I will call thinking in extremes. And the 5 thinking traps in this group are, number 1, black and white thinking, also known as polarized thinking, all or nothing thinking, splitting, dichotomous reasoning. Number 2 is overgeneralization. No other name for this one that I know of. Number 3 is mental filter, also called simply filtering or selective abstraction. Number 4, discounting the positive, also disqualifying the positive. And finally, number 5 is magnification, also known as awfulizing and catastrophizing. Thank you, Albert Ellis. So I'm going to go through each one in turn, starting with black and white thinking. So that's also called all or nothing thinking. This is David Burns' preferred term for it. And so that's because this thinking trap makes you believe that something is either all good or all bad, either black or white, nothing in between. An example might be, well, if just one person dislikes my presentation, then it will have been a total disaster. See, even a small imperfection seems to upset the apple cart. In other words, the way things turn out isn't exactly as you had expected, and then you consider it to be a failure. This kind of reminds me of a saying I read a long time ago. If you pour a glass of wine into a barrel of sewage, you get sewage. If you pour a glass of sewage into a barrel of wine, you get sewage. So the thing is, life is never black or white. It has a lot more nuances than that. And when you place people or circumstances in either or categories with no shades of gray, that's just too rigid and reductionistic. It doesn't allow for the complexity of real life situation and of real people. Here are some more examples of reductionist black and white thinking. I'm either all good or all bad. If you're not with us, you're against us. I ate an ice cream sundae for dessert. My diet is totally shot. I might as well give up. You can also find words like always, every, or never in your negative thoughts. And these may indicate the presence of all or nothing thinking, but it may also indicate its cousin distortion or twin distortion, overgeneralization, and we'll look at that next. But before we do that, let's see what technique you can use to defeat the black and white thinking. Because the source of this thinking trap is the either-or position that does not allow for any middle ground, the main antidote to this type of thinking is called thinking in shades of gray. In this technique, instead of looking at your problem in either-or, black and white categories, you can evaluate them in shades of gray, on a spectrum. So ask yourself if there's a less extreme way to think about your situation. Is it really a complete failure, or is it actually a partial success? This can help you pinpoint specific errors instead of seeing yourself or your performance as a total failure. Remember that things are never as bad or as good as they seem. People are neither nice people or jerks, neither intelligent or morons. Situations aren't either the best or the worst. And relationships aren't either perfect or hellish. We all have a unique mix of strengths and weaknesses, of qualities and faults. Relationships can go through ups and downs, and situations usually tend to have silver linings. So seeing things that way is an example of cognitive flexibility. And the concept of cognitive flexibility is very important for personal well-being. So we will probably revisit this in future episodes. Let's look at the second thinking trap. This is overgeneralization. This is the trap we fall into when we draw broad conclusions from a single piece of evidence. A single event or maybe a small set of events are not really representative of the whole. This thinking pattern is prevalent in many cases. We see one example of a particular ethnic group, and we draw conclusions that extend to the entire group. So let's say I meet a family of Swedish tourists, and I see that everyone in the family has blonde hair and blue eyes. I can easily generalize that all Swedes have blonde hair and blue eyes. And it's a shortcut that our brain can often take. It consumes less processing resources. In history, it's been a good enough first cut approximation for our ancestors. Until proven otherwise, that is. Remember the last episode about the brain being a prediction machine, and that machine has to revise its predictions when the world does not match its blueprint, its model. So the overgeneralization can be not only to a whole category, but also extend to all times. That's when the terms always, never tend to show up. We see a single incident as a sign of a something that will repeat over and over and over. Examples of overgeneralization are, gosh, that job interview went really bad. I'll never be able to get a job. Every guy I've ever dated has been a jerk. All men are jerks. Well, my great aunt smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and she lived to be in her 80s. So you see, smoking ain't really bad for you. You may notice that this last example does not necessarily produce distress, but could be a justification for addictive behavior. Now, in order to undermine the faulty thinking in overgeneralization and to come out of the trance that we've put ourselves in, we can use a technique that's called examine the evidence. So to do this, ask yourself, what are the facts? What do the facts show? What do I know to be true? In the Feeling Good podcast over a year ago, David gave the example of a woman whose daughter had been shot in the face when she went out to play in the street. And so the woman was convinced that she was a bad mother because she let her daughter go out and play. So after that, for 9 years, she cared for her daughter. She took her to all kinds of therapy, for reconstructive surgery, as well for treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. And when she examined the evidence, she found out that she had used a single event, her daughter being shot, to prove that she was a bad mom. But she had not looked at the countless hours she had spent helping to bring her daughter back to health. My brilliant colleague Jill Levitt points out that when you present the evidence, which you present to yourself, of course, not really to somebody else, you have to do this as a defense attorney would do it in front of a court, in that you cannot argue, as in the case I just mentioned, that you're a bad mother simply because you feel like you're a bad mother. You have to present hard evidence, or that won't stand up in a court of law. The third distortion is mental filter, also referred to as filtering or selective abstraction. So in this thinking trap, in order to evaluate a situation, you focus specifically on one detail, and typically a negative one, and then you ignore the rest. The automatic thoughts rehash that one detail. An example of that would be if you were giving a speech in front of an audience, and then you used the wrong word, or you mispronounced it a couple of times, or you stumbled on it like I just did. You might think to yourself, I made a mistake twice while giving the speech, so I'm sure no one understood me. The vast majority of the speech may have gone fine, but you discard that part of the story to concentrate too strongly on one or two salient moments of it. Have you ever turned in some homework that you thought was pretty good, but there were a couple of errors in it? And when the teacher returned the corrected homework back to you, you had an almost perfect score, but with a couple of red annotations on the paper. Weren't the red marks what you focused on first? Similarly, if you're having a generally easy time, like everything is working well in your life, and it's been that way for a while, so you get used to it, you actually start taking it for granted. And then some small incident happens. You get a flat tire on your way to work, your partner leaves a pile of dishes in the sink, your boss passes you up for leading a particular project. In that moment, you can be tempted to believe a thought along the lines of, life sucks. What you're forgetting in that moment is that just about everything else in your life is going hunky-dory. The only snag is the incident you're focusing on at that moment. That's mental filtering. So you could defeat mental filtering using the same technique that you use for overgeneralization, that is, examine the evidence. But just to introduce another technique for variety's sake, I propose that you use something that's called the externalization of voices. That's a role-play technique, so you may want to ask a friend or a partner to help you with that. It's based on the principle that we're more likely to resist a negative voice when it comes from the outside than when it originates from within our own head. So take the previous negative thought. life sucks, and ask your friend to just say that to you. They'll be taking on the role of your own negative voice, but it's externalized. And your job as the positive voice is to be the defense attorney and to really put the lie to that voice by bringing to light all the good things that are actually going really well in your life. You have to do that with complete conviction or it won't work. You need to find it within yourself to defeat that negative voice completely. You need to have really big wins. The externalization of voices is a very powerful technique, and we'll revisit that again. If you've been a faithful listener of the Feeling Good podcast, you will have noticed that David uses it all the time when working with a live volunteer. The fourth thinking trap is discounting the positive or disqualifying the positive. This applies to our own qualities and our performance. So it's turned inward. It leads us to dismiss our own strengths and successes. We will reinforce negative feelings we have about ourselves, and we will explain away the positive ones. Imagine someone who's hosting a dinner and spent hours slaving away in the kitchen in order to prepare it. If the guests make compliments about the food, the cook may be responding like this. "Oh, it's nothing really. Just a few vegetables and a roasted chicken. Actually, the chicken is a bit overcooked." So the cook is actually disqualifying him or herself. Personally, I'm convinced that there's a cultural element in this pattern. I think some cultures are more prone than others to deflect compliments. If we are used to looking at ourselves that way, we may be likely to be down on ourselves when our performance is not a perfect score. This tendency can also be magnified if we're feeling depressed, because when we're in a depression, we tend to wear dark-colored mental glasses that really dull everything that's positive. Think of your core beliefs that may come into play as well. A good antidote to discounting the positive is called the double standard technique. It's another role-play technique, and it's based on the fact that most of us can muster empathy for the people we care about. And we would never dream of treating another human being as poorly as we treat ourselves. So here again, ask a partner to pretend that they're a clone of yourself. They're somebody of the same age, same gender, with the same background, and in particular, somebody with the same negative thoughts. And have him or her ask you for advice and support, coming to you with a thought you might have about yourself, like, I was just promoted to a management position, but I'm not fit for it. As soon as my boss finds out the truth, he'll see that I'm a fraud. So that's a version of the imposter syndrome. Your job in this technique is to be empathetic and pointing out the good qualities of your friend/clone. When you feel like you've done a good job of putting your friend back on track, he or she is supposed to say to you, "Wow, is that true? Is that really true? You're not just blowing smoke in my face? Yeah? Well, so let me see if it's true for me. Wouldn't that be true for you too?" Number 5, the last one of the thinking traps is magnification. And there's 2 versions of it, awfulizing and catastrophizing. You may have noticed that there's quite a bit of overlap between all of the distortions we've talked about. It's not a bug, it's a feature. And it also means that if you were to find one thinking trap, one distortion, you're likely to find several others. So in the case of magnification, we make a mountain out of a molehill. And there's a little bit of a difference between awfulizing and catastrophizing. So awfulizing is taking an objectively minor problem and seeing it as terrible. To use a pretty mundane example, we would break a fingernail and feel like it's the end of the world. Look at this as a lack of resilience in the face of the inevitable challenges of life. Whereas catastrophizing is a negative prediction of the future. Think in this case of a mother who's expecting her teenage son home. The teenager has borrowed the family car to go see a friend, and he's 10 minutes late returning home. the mom immediately starts to imagine that her son just had a terrible car accident, and she's picturing his mangled body in a terrible car wreck. So magnification is the exaggeration of either the importance of an event or the exaggeration of likelihood of an event. In the case above, although car accidents, including fatal ones, are possible, the likelihood that the 10-minute delay is due to a bad car accident is actually pretty low on a short drive, on any particular instance. So once again, as in the other cognitive distortions in this group of thinking in extremes, examine the evidence is still a good technique to apply, in particular if facing a case of catastrophizing. Catastrophizing, remember, is when you project into the future something terrible is going to happen. That would be a key phrase. Awfulizing, you can use another possible technique, something that's called the semantic method. And in this technique, the harsh language, like terrible or horrible, is toned down to a more moderate and more accurate level. So for example, if I feel bad because I had a horrible time at the party, I can recall that, indeed, the hors d'oeuvres were not particularly good, and this man who kept talking about his race cars was a bit of a bore. But it's a long shot to call that horrible. So here we are. We have finished reviewing the 5 thinking traps in the Thinking in Extremes group. As a reminder, those thinking traps were called black and white thinking, overgeneralization, mental filter, discounting the positive, and magnification. And I want to thank my mentor, Dr. David Burns, for having put those cognitive distortions on the map. We have to diagnose correctly where our thinking goes off course before we try to find a cure, so thank you, David. We will examine the next group in our next episode. I call this group Arbitrary Inferences. But for now, this concludes this episode of Peace at Last. For more information, go to peaceatlast.us, where you'll find the show notes for this episode and for future episodes. If you have comments or questions, please leave them on the website. You'll find a link called Leave a Comment or Leave a Reply. Or you can email me directly at fabrice@life.net. I may be selecting your questions as a topic for a future episode. If you just discovered this podcast, I invite you to subscribe on iTunes or on the platform of your choice. If you like it and you want to support it, please share this episode with at least one person who might enjoy it. You can also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating that will make it easier and possible for other people to find it. I am Dr. Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join me next time for another episode of Peace at Last.